We're going to learn Daf Samach Gimel, and we're going to begin on the bottom of Daf Samach Beis Omid Beis. Omar Avinu, and that is 3.5 lines up from the bottom of the Omid. Hashta di Omar of Chizda mechusar hagrola ki mechusar maser domi. In other words, Rav Chizda had established that if you have a chiyuv of shchitas haseirim under the law of shchutei chutz, and the reason for that is because they are roy lemusafim. You can use the soyer instead of lashem or lazazel. You can redirect it and use it as a soyer lemusafim, and it's not called mechusar zman because it's all within the same day. And Rav Chizda says that there's a concept called mechutzar hagrola. And what that means is that the chiyuv of shchitas haseirim under the law of shchutei chutz only applies because they're roy lemusafim, as we said before. But if they're not roy lemusafim, then Rav Chizda would not say that you're chayav for shchitas chutz because you need roy le pesach ol moed, as we discussed in the previous year. So now we need a hagrola in order to designate which one of the two seirim will be lashem and is roy le pesach ol moed. But Rav Chizda says that even though the hagrola is not a ma'aseh b'guf hasoyer, it's only a mitzvah. Nevertheless, it's considered mechusar ma'aseh dam. And in the note, he says that even though the Gemara really understood this from the get-go, bepashtus, you didn't have to pin it on Rav Chizda, because the Gemara had already said ad shelo higril alehem lamai chazu. But nevertheless, the Gemara quotes Rav Chizda as if he were the Baal Achid. She was the one who was machadish this halach. So now the Gemara raises the following point. Hadi Omar, we could derive the following conclusion. Hadi Omar of Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Shlomim sheshchatan, Kodem sheniftachu dalsos hahechal. He shechted the carbon shlomim early in the morning before they opened up the hechal, the dalsos of the hechal in the Beis Hamikdash. Why? Shenemar, it says with regard to the carbon shlomim in Vayikra Perek Gimel Ushchato Pesach Ol Moed, and we darshan that the carbon shlomim is kosher fa'akrova only bisman shehu, meaning the hechal pasuach, lo bisman shehu no. It cannot be kosher l'shchita when they still haven't opened the doors of the hechal. And here we turn to Samach Gimel. And the Gemara is going to now, based on Rav Chizda, derive the following conclusion. And that is, Shchatan b'chutz konim sheniftachu dalsos hahechal patur. He would not be chayav for shchutei chutz if he shechted a carbon shlomim outside of the Azara before they opened up the doors of the hechal. My timer, because mechusar psicha ki mechusar ma'aseh domi. Just like we said in the case of the soil azazel, that before the hagrola, it's considered mechusar ma'aseh. The same logic should apply to the chisaron in the case of psichas dalsos hahechal. It should be considered a chisaron in the behema itself, in the guf behema, like we saw in the case of hagrola. Rav Chizda was committed to the position that before hagrola, it's a chisaron in the guf behema. So even though technically, in reality, the psicha of the hechal is not a ma'aseh b'guf hashlamim, but nevertheless, because there's no shechita before psichas telosos, it's considered a chisaron in the guf behema, and it's not roy lepesach ol moed, and therefore it doesn't engender the chiyuv of shchutei chutz, just like the case of shnei se'irim before the hagrola. Now the Gemara is going to continue to analyze Rav Chizda's principle that the reason why there's someone who shechs a carbon that's not royal b'fnim is if it's not roy for anything. Let's say, for example, you shechted a carbon and it's not roy b'fnim for that which you originally designated for, then you would be chayav for shchutei chutz if it's roy for a different carbon. And that we discussed with the case of Sarah Mishtaleach, that there would be a shchutei chutz problem if you could redirect the soyer towards a musa. But that's before we get to the fact that hagrola, chisaron hagrola is chisaron maisadam. So if not for the fact that the absence of hagrola is considered mechusar maisa, if not for that, we would generate a chiyuv of shchutei chutz in soyer, sorry mishtalech, because it could be redirected as a soyer lemusaf. So Gemara asks the following kasha: Mi islay the Rav Chizda hoil? Does Rav Chizda actually hold of the principle of hoil that you're chayav for shchutei chutz in a carbon, even though it's not roy l'shmo for its own designated carbon, because of hoil? Since it could be roy for akrova under a different category of a different carbon, va'amar Rav Chizda pesach sheshchato machutz b'shar yemos hashana. He designated a lamb as a carbon pesach, and he shechted it outside the azara during the rest of the year, not on the 14th of Nisan, the zman of hakrovas haPesach. And Rav Chizda says it depends. If he shechted it lishmo, meaning for the purpose of a carbon pesach, then he's potter. He's not chayav for shchutei chutz because it's not royally karb bifnim as a carbon pesach. If it was shechted inside the azara lishmo, it would be possible because it's pesach b'chayim otzashana. But shalol lishmo, if he shechted it for the purpose of a carbon shlomim rather than a carbon pesach, then it's chayav kares before shchutei chutz because pesach b'chayim otzashana is royally karev if it could be suitable as a carbon shlomim bifnim. So the Gemara now is medayik, because so far it sounds like Rav Chizda is just reiterating what the same principles reflecting that he had before. Taima, says the Gemara, the reason why he's chayav kares for shchutei chutz is because Dishalol Lishma, he actually had in mind, and maybe even a declaration, I am shechting this Pesach L'Shem Shlomim. The implication is Hastama. If he shechted it what we call Stam, he didn't explain and declare that he's doing it for any carbon whatsoever, then that would be Lishma. And that's based on a principle of Stama Lishma. Then unless he's Oker, and he undermines the shame of the carbon, we assume in a stomach situation that he's checking it for the purpose of that carbon. Upotter. And now we're going to say he's potter. Wait a second. V'amai lema hoil. Why don't we apply the principle of hoil as Rav Chizda did in the case of a sayer for roi shalol lishma bifnim? That if he had shechted this animal inside the azara l'shem shlomim, then it would be kosher. It would be a perfectly valid carbon shlomim, because that's the status of Pesach B'Shayim Osat Shana. And yet, in this very case of Stama, Rav Chizda says that you're potter. You see clearly that he's not operating with the principle of Hoil. And yet, when it came to shechting the Seirim of Yom Kippurim Bachutz, he applied the principle of Hoil. And since they're royal is soyer hanasa b'chutz, therefore he was willing to be mechayev. So the Gemara comes up with the following very fundamental distinction. Hachi hasht. Let's analyze this and find a distinction between Pesach and Seirim. Hasam, in the case of a carbon Pesach, when he wants to shech it, b'shayimos hashana l'shlamim, boy akira, he has to change the original designation of the Shem Pesach. And now he has to shecht it explicitly l'shem shlomim. If he shechts it stam, it's called a korban pesach, and it's not roy lios karev shlomim, and certainly it's not roy li karev pesach. And as long as he wasn't oker the shem by having a definite positive machshava l'shem shlomim, then it's called mechusar maisa, and we're not going to apply hoil, and we're not going to be machayev someone who's makar b'chutz in a case of mistama. But here in the case of Sira Yom Kippurim, lo boy akira, he doesn't have to be oker the shem soyer anasa b'fnim in order to be makrivid as a soyer chatos shel korban musaf anasa b'chutz. When I say b'chutz, I mean in the mizbeach hachitzon, and we don't need an akira of the shem. In both cases, whether it's b'fnim or b'chutz, it's a soyer lechatos. It's the same exact category of a korban, and therefore, if he shechts it b'chutz b'stam, he's going to be chayev. It's considered roy la'akrivo l'shem soyer chatos shel musaf anas b'chutz v'chitzon, and that is definitely reconcilable with Rav Chisda's position with regard to Pesach, because in the case of Pesach, if he only had a machshav of stomach, then in that state, without an akira, the korban Pesach cannot be brought neither in Shlomim, because it needs an akira shem Pesach, nor as Pesach because it's shalom b'zmana. And therefore, there's no hoil to apply that it should be roy le korban b'fnim for a korban in the old moed. Rabba bar Shimi masni lahu b'derabba. He has these statements that we had before that were quoted in the name of Chizli. He has in the name of Rabba, v'kashale Rabba de Rabba, and it was difficult. They found a stira from Rabba in one statement to Rabba in the other statement, because both statements are now being attributed to Rabba, both the statement about the Seirim and about the Korban Pesach, umeshani kid umeshanina, and they gave the exact answer that we had before, namely that Pesach b'shayimos Hashanah requires akira in order to be roy, that it could be suitable for akrav shlomim, and therefore we don't apply hoil. Whereas in Se'ira Yom Kippur we don't need an akira, because as we said before, they're all korban chatos, and therefore we can apply the principle of hoil, and therefore he's chayav for shkutei chutz. He also Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, Omar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Omar Rabbi Yochanan, he said the name Rabbi Yirmiyah, who in turn was quoting Rabbi Yochanan, that if you have a korban that was designated as a Pesach, sheshchato bachutz b'shar yemos hashana, bein lishmo, ubein shelo lishmo, potu. He will not have violated the Iser of Shkutei Chutz, even in a case where he shechted it, Shelo Lishma. And you would have said that, all right, if he shechted it, Lishma, L'Shem Korban Pesach, fine. I understand it's not Roy for Pesach or Moed, and therefore you're part of Shkutei Chutz. But if he shechted it, Shelo Lishma, it means he shechted L'Shem Shlomim. And it's royally kari v'torah shlomim. So why should we part of v'shechted b'chutz? The Omar Rav Dimi said, until now, we had his first statement in the name of Rav Yirmiyah, in the name of Rav Yochanan, but now Rav Dimi adds, Amrisa l'shmaita, I had a discussion about this sugya kami de Rav Yirmiyah, and I asked him the following question. Bishlam, I understand in the case of Lishmo, if he had in mind L'Shem Korban Pesach lo chazile, you cannot bring it inside the Azora as a Korban Pesach because it's Pesach b'shayimos Hashana, and therefore it's not royally ol moed. It's not, doesn't generate a chiyuv of shkutei chutz, and that's called the lo chazil. Elo shelo lishmo l'shem shlomim, amai, why should it be potter? Hachazi, it's royally ol moed shelo lishmo b'fnim. you're allowed to be makriv, and that's exactly what you'll do in a case of shalol l'shmo l'shem shlomim. This original carbon pesach will be brought l'shem shlomim, and it's a kosher carbon shlomim. And therefore, the question arises: why shouldn't it be chayav for shchutei chutz? The Amar Li, and as Rav Dimi reports that Rav Yirmiyah responded, and he said the reason for the ptur is because you need an akira of the Shem Pesach in order to be machshured as a carbon shlomim bifnim in the Azara. The akiras chutz, and to be oker the Shem carbon through a shchita outside the Azor, lav shmei akira. That's not a meaningful and effective akira. You cannot change the status of this lamb as a Pesach by shechting it l'shem shlomim outside of the Azor. So therefore, in the din of akira shem carbon Pesach, to be machshured as a shem shlomim, we need a shchita b'fnim in the Azor. And here, in this particular case, the Shem Pesach remains, and there was no successful Akira because he shefted it outside the Azara. And that Shechita cannot redesignate what we call Akira, the carbon Pesach. So it has and continues to have a Shem Pesach, and therefore it's not royally Kar Bifnim, and he's part of a Shechita. Ki also Ravin, when Ravin went to Bavel, Omar, Rabbi Yirmiyah, Omar Rabbi Yochanan, he had the exact opposite transmission in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that Karma was mafresh l'shem Pesach, sheshchato b'chutz b'shar yemos hashana, bein shlishmo, bein shalo l'shmo, chayav, he's chayav for shchutei, meaning it's royal lakrova, as a shalolishmo bifnim inside the Azara. So it's roy le'ol moed. It has the status through hoil of a chiyuv of shchutei chutz. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. If you're talking about the case of a carbon pesach, b'shayimos hashana, let's think about this. The Gemara asks the following question: the chi, meaning, can you be chayav shayimos hashana for shchutei chutz afilu lishmo, even if he shefts it l'shem carbon pesach? Vasnan, we have a Mishnah at the end of Zvachim that in terms of a carbon that's mechusar zman, in other words, it's not royal akrava yet, and therefore the din is in such a case of yeshefta b'chutz yipotu, it's bein begufo ubein bebailin. Now we'll have to see what bein bebailin means. The Gemara is going to analyze that. But bein begufo, if it's mechutz zman begufo, like for example, it's within the first 8 days since it was born, and the Torah says sharo keves o ez ki voled v'ya shivas yom tachas imo miyom hashmini v'hela yerotza lekarban ishe Hashem. So this is called mechusas man big gufo. And what's ubein b'balim? So we'll have to take a little digression here. The Gemara wants to know what bein b'balim is. Ezu mechusas man b'balim. And here we have a concept called mechutzar kapara. In the following 4 cases, Zav, Zav, Yoledes, and Mitzorah, all these 4 are called mechutzar kapara. And they have to bring a carbon for their tara on day number 8. And for example, in the cases of a Zav, Zava, and a Mitzorah, they have to count 7 days. That means after they've completed their tumah, they needed an extra counting of 7 days, and on the 8th day they bring their karbonos. The Zav and the Zava bring Shnei Torim or Shnei Bnei Yona, Echel L'chatos V'echel Li'olah. Mitzorah bring Shnei Kvasim, Echel Li'osham V'echel Li'olah. The Kivsa Achas L'chatos. If he's an Oni, he brings a Keves Li'osham and Shnei Torim or Shnei Bnei Yona one for a chatas, one for an olah. And in all these cases, we have what's called mechusar zman b'bailin. And hikrivu chatosam v'ashamam b'chutz. If their carbon chatos or osha was shechted b'chutz, and it's before the time of the akrova, pturim. These karbanos are not ruyim li karev, the pesach ol moed, bifnim at all. It's not appropriate and valid for their chova, their obligation as a chatas v'yosham, because the bailim amachus zman, they're not up to the 8th day, and the chiyuv hasn't emerged yet, and you cannot redirect these karbanos as a carbon adava, because the halacha is that chatas v'yasham einam kravim bin adava. However, if they were makriv olotseim v'shalmeim b'chutz, because as we said earlier, the mitzora has to bring a carbon ola and a carbon shlomim. That's what we mentioned earlier. Kivsa achas, so shnei kvasim echad liyashim echad ola. So in such a case, is bachutz chayovim. If they're makriv these karbonos of ol and shlomim bachutz, since these karbonos, as opposed to chatas v'yosham, can be brought inside the azara as a nedava, therefore it's royal pesach ol moed. It's not called b'chusar zman because it's royal akrova right now as a nedava. The Omer Abchilkia Bar Tuvi Lo Shanu, when the Mishnah says that a shochet asham bachutz and he's mechusas man b'bailin, he's part of mishum chute chutz because it cannot be redirected as a carbon adava. Is that only applies ella lishmo if he shechted the carbon l'shem asham. It's not royal asham b'fnim because it's kodem zmano. We haven't reached day 8 yet. And as we said before, an asham cannot be redirected as a carbon nidav. So it's absolutely excluded from hakrova b'fnim. And therefore, it's mechusas man b'bailim, and he's potter mishum shkutei chutz. Avol shalo lishmo. But if, on the other hand, he shechts l'shem ola or l'shem shlomim, is then chayav. Here it's roy likarev bifnim, because the Mishnah says at the beginning of the Svachim, kol carbon, the exception of carbon pesach and chatos, shenishchat bifnim, shalo l'shem mashu omed, meaning shalo l'shma, hareu kosher elo lo yatsu, bailim lo ol l'shem chovasam. They'll have to bring a replacement carbon. Now, we see here clearly that if he shechts an asham, mechusas man, outside of the azor lishmo, he is potter, be a potter. According to Ravin in the name of Yochanan, if you shecht the carbon pesach during the rest of the year, bachutz l'shem pesach he's chayav. Why? Because he could have been makrovit shalo l'shmo. And Amai, here too, in the case of Asham, why should it be part of Shkutei Chutz? Name, why don't we apply the principle of Hol Uyim Shalo Lishmo Bifnim? If he shefted it, Konem Zmano, before the 8th day, but Bifnim, and it is royal akrava shalol lishmo. Again, it's a funny kind of royal akrava. It's a royal akrava of kosher v'eno olo l'baylo l'shem chavasa. So the Gemara answers hachi hashta. In other words, you're equating the din of Asham in Mechusas Man to the din of Pesach b'Shayimos Hashana. They're not similar at all. The Hasam with regard to Asham, if you want to shech l'shem olo l'shem shlomim boy akira, you're going to have to undermine and cancel the shame Asham. And we shechzit l'shmo, he didn't do that at all. He wasn't okay the shame karma. And therefore, right now, it's Eno Roy li Olmoy to be shechted b'fnim, and therefore he's part of a shchit b'chutz. But hacha, in the case of Pesach b'shoyvos Hashana, shlomim ninu, he doesn't have to be oker the shame Pesach in order to be machshered as a shlomim. It automatically becomes and takes on the identity of a korban shlomim, and therefore he's chayav for shchutei chutz because it automatically reverts to shlomim. Sharivos Hashan, and therefore it's royally Karev Bifnim. Rav Ashi Masni, he has the transmission of Ravin that if you shech to Korban Pesach b'Shar Yemos Hashana, Bein Lishmo, Bein Shalol Lishmo, Chayav, Kidabrina. Just like we said earlier, in the opinion of Ravin, in the name of Rabbi Yirmi, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, because Pesach, B'Shar Yemos Hashana, is Chayav for Shchutei Chutz, Bein Shochat Lishmo, Bein Shochat Shalol Lishmo, because it doesn't require an Akira during the Shar Yemos Hashana. And it automatically becomes a Korban Shalom, and therefore it's royally Korban B'fnim. Rabbi Yirmi Midifti Masne, he has a different transmission of Ravin in the case of shechting of Pesach, Bein Lishmo, Bein Shalol Lishmo, Potter, that in all cases, Ravin would say, you are Potter. And why is that so? Mishum de Kasovar, Pesach, B'Shar Yemos Hashana, Boy Akira. You cannot be machshered as a korban shlomim without being first oker the shame. That's the status of Pesach b'Shar Yemos Hashana. And furthermore, Akiras chutz lav shmei akira. So therefore, when he shechts it and he's oker the shame, b'chutz, meaning outside the Azara, from Pesach to Shlomim, that's not called an akira, and it's eno royally karb b'fnim l'shem Shlomim. And according to Rabbi Yirmi, Difti Pliga de Rav Chilkiah Bar Tuvi, Ravin, who holds that Akira's chutz is not considered Akira, he refutes, he rejects the Shita of Chilkiah Bar Tuvi, Sha'amar, who holds that a Shochet Osham Mechusas Man Bachutz Shalol Lishmo Chayav, because he holds that Akira's chutz Shmei Akira. And therefore, even if you had a designation as a korban asham, in a case of mechusas man bachutz, he would be chayav because once he does the shchita bachutz, he is being oker chutz, and that's considered a valid akira. Omar Mar, we learned early on Daf Samach Beis in Beis in a Brisa that if you shech the seirim bachutz, if it's Misha Higril Alim, if he had already implemented the lottery, the Hagrola, Chayav al Shom Shem, Upater al Shal Azazel, the soil Azazel that's now been designated by virtue of the Hagrola is Eino Royally Kar Bifnim. And we send it out to the Midbar with an Ish Iti, and they push it over the precipice, but nowhere do we see that it's Roy Lakrov. It's not Roy Lakrov at all. It's completely Avodas Chutz. Masha Eiken, as far as the Sorel Hashem is concerned, that's Roy LePesach Oel, And after the Agrola, he'll be chayav if he shechts the soyer shel shem outside of the Azor. Torah Rabbanu, we learned in the Brisa, Ish mi beis Yisrael asher yichchat shor o kesev o eiz b'machne o asher yichchat michutz lamachane v'el pesach o moed lo hevil lahakriv korban Hashem v'nichras ha'ish hahu mikerev amo. So the Brisa says that with regard to the parsha of Shchutei Chutz, which we just read, now the Brisa is going to give an explanation.